I'm Andrew Pitts, and I'm the founder and CEO of Polinode. The focus of this session is going to be on organizational network analysis, and in particular on the application of organizational network analysis in the context of diversity and inclusion. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a short presentation just to set the context and provide some background, and then we're going to have a bit of a longer panel discussion afterwards. So in case you haven't come across organizational network analysis or Polinode before, what ONA is it's all about visualizing and analyzing the informal relationships between people inside of organizations. So who's really working with whom rather than the formal reporting structure. And so Polinode is a platform that allows you to collect data on those relationships, to visualize that data as is shown in the screenshot, and to analyze it. So to find out who's central, what the different communities are, and so on. And there's really two types of organizational network analysis. There's active ONA and there's passive ONA. And so passive ONA is where we plug into the digital exhaust of organizations. So it's where we collect data on email communication, on calendar invitations, and increasingly social or enterprise networks as well, right? So think Yammer, think Teams, think Slack, etc. And active organizational network analysis is where we ask people questions about their relationships. So who do you go to for advice? Who do you view as a mentor, and so on? And so Polinode is a platform for both passive ONA in the sense that we can connect to Office 365, to Google Workspace, to Slack, and so on to collect that data, as well as for active organizational network analysis, because we have a fully integrated relationship-based survey tool that allows you to collect that data. And regardless of where that data comes from, it ends up as interactive networks that you can visualize and analyze in Polinode. So with that as background, let's chat a little bit about networks and diversity and inclusion. So, we want to think about moving beyond representation, right? So are we 50% male, 50% female, towards more of the inclusion side of diversity and inclusion is most relevant in the context of networks, right? So here we have a simplified network diagram just to illustrate the point, where it is 50% male, 50% female, 4 males, 4 females, because the males are green and the females are orange. But what we see is this triangle that represents the most senior person in this network is only connected to other men. And so that's the type of thing that we're talking about in the context of networks and diversity and inclusion. Are there parts of our organization where men tend to be connected more to men, women to women, and so on? So those types of questions. So now I want to give about 6 practical kind of applications or examples. So getting hands-on with diversity and inclusion in the context of ONA. And the first one I want to look at is active nominations and how we can use that data. So when we're running an active ONA, the first question that we often ask is a relationship question that's designed to collect information about working relationships along the lines of, please identify up to 20 people at company who are important to your ability to accomplish your work priorities. And we can use that data in a regression. So we can regress the total number of nominations that each person receives on explanatory variables that include seniority and tenure. And we can also add to that regression gender and ethnicity. So demographic attributes around that represent diverse attributes for the talent. And what we get is we get an output like this. So we have a constant, right, which represents the base, if you will, in terms of the number of nominations that people receive. And then you'll see we've included both tenure and tenure squared. So as you would expect, as people increase in terms of the number of years that they've been with an organization, their number of nominations or relationships increase. But what I want to focus on here is this female attribute. So the interpretation of this is that females in this organization relative to males controlling for tenure and also for seniority, which you'll see is included down below, have 2.2 less nominations on average. And we can look at this data because increasingly, organizations are running organizational network analysis in the same way as they do engagement surveys, so once a year or once every 2 years. And so we can look at the change in terms of this coefficient over time. And we can also look at how this might vary in different parts of the organization too. The second example that I'm going to look at here is onboarding. And so you can use, in particular, the passive organizational network analysis data to give you insight into how quickly people are being integrated into the network. So here on the horizontal axis, we have tenure, and on the vertical axis, we have the total number of incoming connections that people have. And so if we look down the bottom there, we can see that these are people that have a relatively low tenure, but also a relatively low degree of connection into the rest of the organization. And it's possible to slice and dice this by different attributes such as gender and ethnicity as well, because it's not just about attracting diverse talent. A really important question as well is, are there differences in how quickly our diverse talent is being integrated into the network? Because that also goes to retaining the diverse talent and effectively making sure that that they are being given the opportunities that that you would want them to be given in terms of their exposure to other people, particularly more senior people in the organization. The third example here is formal and informal mentorship. And this is really important in the context of promotability as well. So we often ask this question, please identify up to 5 people who provide you with career-related advice and assistance. Consider people who are formal or informal mentors or are sounding boards when you need or wish to discuss your career. You may select anyone in the organization. So on the right-hand side, you'll see that we've cut this data by BIPOC versus the non-BIPOC population. So Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And you'll see in particular that the T-2 and the other groups that are the more junior levels in this organization have a lower number of total formal or informal mentor nominations in the BIPOC population than the non-BIPOC population. So we look at T-2, for example, and they have 3 total mentorship nominations, and we can also see how that is divided up between the T levels, so the most senior level, then the T-1 level, which is 1.3. And we can compare that to the non-BIPOC population below, which is 4.3 in total. And we can also compare the different levels there. So, that's a really important and valuable thing to measure, but, how can we turn that into kind of actionable insight as well? And one way that we do that is through individual network reports. And here you'll see an example of such an individual network report, where we give the individual a sense for where they sit in the overall organizational network, right? And then we also provide them with insight into a number of different metrics. And what I've focused on here is the proportion of their connections that are to people that are more senior than themselves, that are their peers, that are more junior than themselves. And what we often find is that, diverse talent in the organization has a tendency to have less connections to people that are more senior than themselves. And back to that original motivating point, that's really important in terms of making sure that people get exposure. It's important around promotability and so on. And so one way that we can make this more actionable is by giving individuals insight into how they compare with other people. The fifth example here is around measuring and testing for homophily. So I won't go into how we test for that statistically, but I want to show you this example on the left-hand side, where this is an organization with a number of different locations, and we've sized the nodes here by the total number of incoming connections. And if you just visually compare location 1 with location 5, you can see how different they are. That in location 1, there's quite a lot of relatively large, that is male nodes with significant kind of informal influence in that network or that part of the network, whereas location 5, it's much more even in terms of the distribution between males and females. And on the right-hand side, we have a collaboration matrix. So the way that you read this is that the rows are the froms and the column headings are the tos. So this means in terms of the relationships that come from females, 39.2% go to females and 60.8% go to males. And we can compare that to the relative size below. And what we find here is that females have a tendency to connect with females 1.3 times more than what we would expect if they were connecting at random. So this allows us to ask, interesting and valuable questions like, how well is our diverse talent represented within the most influential nodes in the network? And as an organization, are there some areas where we are perhaps less inclusive than others? Some areas where diverse team members may be feeling isolated? The final example that I want to walk you through is actually one of my favorite examples, and it's about combining active organizational network analysis with passive organizational network analysis. And so on the left-hand side here, we have the percentile rank of people in terms of their total number of incoming nominations for an active organizational network analysis. So people asking other people, who do you work with often, right? So it's nominations from other people. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got the same thing, but for the passive incoming connections. So that we pulled from email data. And so by its nature, the passive is objective data, whereas the active data relies on people reporting their relationships with other people. And so if you think about the 45-degree line here, if somebody's on that 45-degree line, then their ranking in terms of their active nominations, so reported by other people, is the same as their ranking in terms of the passive connections. Whereas if they're below that 45-degree line, they will have, they'll be ranking more highly on the passive connections than they are on the active connections. And so what we find here with this data set is, because we're colored, again, females are green, males are orange, that if you look at this visually, you can see that there is a tendency for females to be higher in terms of the passive, that is the objective, than the active nominations. And so we can, again, dig into this data and say, is this more true in terms of the active versus the passive nominations for some attributes that represent different measures of diversity in our organization, or in some parts of the organization, is that more true, locations or divisions and so on? And also, how does this change over time too? So there's a lot of really interesting insight and analysis that you can do around that. So that's the last slide that I have to go through. And now we'll go into the panel discussion. Ready? All right, so we're really lucky to have with us here today 3 people analytics leaders, all of which have experience in organizational network analysis. So for a panel discussion about ONA. So what I might do to start off with is just ask them to introduce themselves. So Kate, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm Kate O'Brien. I am Director of People Strategy and Analytics at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard in Boston, Massachusetts, US.
Thanks, Kate. Laura, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I lead the People Planning and Insights team at MetLife, located in Charlotte, North Carolina, US.
Thanks, Laura. Susan?
And I'm Susan Biancani. I lead the People Analytics team at Airbnb, which is headquartered in San Francisco, California.
Thanks, Susan. So the first question I have for everybody is, maybe we can start off with a little bit of background in terms of how you've used organizational network analysis, what kind of use cases you might have used it for, your experience with kind of ONA to date, or anything you're doing currently as well. So Susan, why don't we start off with you if you want to get us going with that question.
Sure. So we have run our first organizational network survey this past November 2020. And at Airbnb, we decided we were more comfortable with active ONA, where employees can know and decide what they're telling us, as opposed to us sort of collecting it passively. And so we ran this survey in conjunction with a belonging survey. Belonging is Airbnb's mission, to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere. And over the course of 2020, we developed a new belonging index, which was based on a pretty extensive literature review, focus groups, and pilot testing. And so we define belonging as having 3 components: relationships with colleagues, inclusive work environment, and the ability to make meaningful contributions at work. And because it's such a relational concept, I was really interested to see how we could get further insight by studying networks. How do the relationships with colleagues really play into employees' feelings of belonging? So we asked a range of ONA questions around friendship, collaboration, expertise, energy, innovation, mentorship, recognition, and trust. And then we said, of all the different things that we measured, which are most predictive of an employee's sort of self-reported feelings of belonging. And we found the single biggest predictor to be recognition. So we had asked a question: who best recognizes the value that you contribute through your work? And we found that the first tie mattered the most. So being able to name at least one person was associated with an 8 percentage point lift in self-reported belonging. And that was net of tenure, level, specifics of the role, and a variety of other things that were correlated with belonging. So to us, that was a really powerful statement of the value of recognition and being able to name someone who recognizes the value of your work. So as a result of that finding, we're kind of doing 2 things in parallel. We've started to develop a toolkit for managers to improve at recognizing their employees and being able to sort of describe the value of team members' work to them. And we're also running now a qualitative study where we're interviewing employees about when they have felt recognized and what did the other person actually do to make them feel that way. And we focused that on around recognizers who were kind of identified as super recognizers, people who are nominated up by a lot of other employees as recognizing their value, to understand what are those people doing well and what is the impact of that on the people they work with. And so we'll develop some more assets for employees based on the findings of that.
Awesome. I love that term, super recognizers. That's a nice one. And yeah, really good use of active organizational network analysis. And maybe we can get into the active versus passive debate in a little bit. Laura, do you want to go next?
Sure, and I'll start the debate a little bit. We've only done passive ONAs for a variety of reasons, although I think we are at a point in some of our work where active is becoming more and more required to get at some of the qualitative information. We've done a few different types of work with our passive ONA. One is we spent some time studying the change in the network patterns since we went into a lockdown. So we baselined before COVID and then looked at after the COVID work arrangements to look for employees that were becoming disconnected from the broader network, who was tightening relationships with their teams, how were communities forming differently. We found some interesting tidbits. We found that while our central players became a bit more diverse, that our communities became more homogenous. So we're looking further to understand the impact of that on inclusion. We're just starting our pulse survey. Today, we only do an annual survey at MetLife, and we're developing a pulsing routine. So we're going to start to see how the change in the network patterns relate to changes in people's feelings around things like inclusion and belonging. We've also actually used ONA to inform org design. So looking at communities to see where clusters of work are really forming and thinking about how we can structure our organization instead of superimposing an artificial hierarchy on the organization, we tend to look at groups that are naturally working together and think about how can we organize around these teams.
I think both of those are probably on more of the cutting edge in terms of organizational network analysis, the last two that you just mentioned there. So I think there is so much potential in the combination of engagement data and network data, right? So much there. I think it's definitely, I think, going to be a lot more attention paid to that. And also, I think the workplace design one and the organizational design one as well. And I know there's a lot of interest in the COVID question too. So thank you. Thanks, Laura. Kate, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so we've done 2 ONAs. We did an active one in 2017, and we did a passive one about 6 months ago. And then we're about to launch one next week. That's going to be the combination of active and passive. The one we did in 2017 that was active, we have a lot of affinity groups at our company, and the culture and community affinity group, Broad, was growing rapidly. And we have really high engagement scores. Like, they're so high, they're actually hard to increase. And the culture and community affinity group wanted to really capture, we knew our culture was really positive and healthy, but we didn't know what are the things people are doing, what are the practices, what are the norms that departments put in place to make that possible. And the idea was, if they could conduct focus groups and interviews with critical people across some departments, they could create a playbook of sorts of things that people can do as we're growing to know, what has resulted in success. And we already knew from our engagement scores which groups to particularly talk to because they were particularly strong. So I had approached this group. I was chomping at the bit to try ONA. I had read about it. And asked them, could we do an ONA to figure out the right people for the culture and community people to talk to within the departments? And my hypothesis was, if we could identify the energizers, I thought those were the people who were the culture carriers. And it was really successful. I mean, the great thing about Broad is people are always up for an experiment. But what we found was similar to what the research shows. About 30% of the people who were interviewed were not the usual suspects who everyone thinks about. Everyone who we interviewed, when we told them that they were energizers, they were all flattered and delighted to know that we knew that, but they already knew that about themselves. And the culture and community team said they wouldn't have gotten the results they got from the project if we hadn't have identified these people through the ONA, because as soon as they sat down with them and started describing, trying to understand, what are the norms, processes, techniques you put in place to create this great culture, all of these people said, oh, this is what I do. And they could explicitly talk about what they do and why, because they were the culture carriers. So that was 2017. And then this past year, we in 2017, we did the ONA manually because cloud-based tools didn't exist then. And one of my takeaways was we couldn't do it again. It just took so many resources. It just wasn't scalable. So last year we bought Polinode. So I was really excited because I created a peer-to-peer feedback program, and I wanted to check, we use design principles from the research on best practices to put in place for these feedback programs. But often in the research, it says that women and people of color, there tends to be bias in feedback and performance reviews. And so I wanted to use passive ONA to check for bias. So we did this peer-to-peer feedback program. We had certain design principles in place that were, I thought, my hypothesis is we wouldn't have bias if we had these design principles in place. And so I used Polinode, and it was great because I could, the tool we used for feedback, we couldn't tell what feedback was given, but we could tell who gave feedback to who requested feedback. And so we were able to put it into Polinode and check for bias. And what I expected to find were potentially racial or gender silos. So women tend to ask more feedback from women. People of color tend to ask for more feedback from people of color because there isn't as much integration. And we found the exact opposite. We found that there was no bias in this pilot. It was about 450 people, which is great because especially, anyone familiar with the United States these days, racial unrest, racial injustice is a top of mind topic. And so I was going to do this anyway, but our company director came out and said we were going to become an anti-racist organization. And so I thought one way of doing that is when HR develops new programs, we should be testing for bias and making sure that there are not, unforeseen impact on women or people of color. And I think, to find out that the program didn't have that, I think the most rewarding part about that too is at the same time, our diversity and inclusion team were doing focus groups with employees who are African American or Black, and unprompted, they brought up this pilot and how awesome this pilot was and how inclusive it felt for them. And they didn't realize that I was doing a passive ONA to see if there was bias. So we had both the quantitative and the qualitative results for that. And so we're expanding the program, and that's probably some of the work I'm most proud of I've ever done at Broad.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting one, because I think a lot of times when people think about organizational network analysis, they often think that they need to go out and collect the data, which is often, what, we do, right? Whether it's active or passive. But the fact that there is, often this untapped data from, feedback, I think that's, I would love to see more people tapping into that feedback data, particularly for that diversity and inclusion kind of use case there. And a question for all of you, because diversity and inclusion has come up a little bit, and obviously before this I gave a short presentation on diversity and inclusion, is I'd love to just hear from you kind of how important you think that diversity and inclusion application of organizational network analysis is in the scheme of things for you.
I'll jump in. I think it's enormously important. I think that we in the US and probably in many places in the world have really spent a lot of time measuring representation, measuring diversity, because it's very easy to do that. But diversity without inclusion does not accomplish its goal of elevating diversity of perspectives and bringing one's best to the table to produce business results, frankly. And the ability to look at networks and how people interact and who they interact with and how communities form is, to me, a game changer to get at inclusion, because it's really hard to measure that. So I think it's enormous.
Yeah.
And we know from the academic literature that homophily, birds of a feather flock together is a real thing. And it has real deleterious impacts, both for individuals who may get excluded, but also for the ability for information to flow freely through a network. And for the time it takes, just for information to get from point A to point B in a network, the more partitioned that network is, the less effective the organization is going to be at sharing information. So, without getting into detail on any particular projects that we've done on this, it's a real interest to make sure that that we don't have silos created by homophily.
Yeah, we've got enough silos as it is, right? So we promised to have a bit of a chat on active versus passive ONA. Because we have, obviously, Susan, you've focused on active. Laura, you've, I think, exclusively been passive. And Kate, you've been active to date, but I sense an excitement about the possibility of combining active and passive together, which I think is definitely kind of an emerging trend in an area. So I'd just love to hear, maybe, Susan, if we can start with you again, your thoughts on the active versus passive. What drew you towards active to begin with, and are you kind of considering passive?
Yeah, I mean, the appeal, I'll start with the opposite, which is the appeal of passive being that you know it's complete. You can look historically over time, you know, and it's just a lot more information. The one downside is, you know, you have to decide what is a tie. You know, if I've emailed you once 6 months ago, are we tied or not? And does it matter if other people are CC'd on there? So there are just a lot of analytical decisions that you need to take before you can make meaning from the data that you have. With a survey, it's a lot clearer what the meaning is because, you know, you're relying on the respondent to tell you what things mean. So from that perspective, it was a nice way for us to start. But the really decisive factor for Airbnb was just wanting to be very transparent with employees and wanting to give people absolute control to participate or not participate. Obviously, someone else can name you as a friend, and even if you've opted out of taking the survey, but we wanted to give people the opportunity to decide, are they going to take the survey? Which questions are they going to answer? How much information are they going to give? Our response rate was around 70%. Which, you know, it would be lovely if it was 100%, but we felt it was high enough to be able to make some inferences with it, particularly because we were really focused on ego level networks as opposed to sort of global network measures, which would be more sensitive to the missing data. And it was just a good, I guess, soft start for us. We are now, you know, now that we've done the survey, done the analysis, we're making the rounds with different leadership teams. We're showing them, you know, here's what your part of the organization looks like. Here, you know, here's some hidden talent in your team that you may not have known about. Here are the energizers. Here's how mentorship looks. And there's so much excitement. You know, they're interested in the analysis and in the stats, but when you put up the graph and it's color coded and they're different sizes and it all means something and they can say, oh, like there's that team, I know those guys. People get so excited about it and really feel like they understand their team and their organization a lot better. And so over time, we may move to do a combination. But for now, we decided this was the best way to start and to start building momentum and energy around the idea.
Yeah. So, and I think that's not unusual. I think it's not unusual for people to start with active, generate kind of interest and value and insight through active, and then that propels people into passive at a later point. I definitely kind of see that a fair bit. So yeah, really, really interesting to hear that. And Laura, from your side, I think you started with passive, which is a little bit different, right?
I did, and for many of the reasons that Susan mentioned in terms of being able to compare snapshots in time, we're also measuring what people do rather than what they say they do. We know sometimes there's pressures to respond to surveys in a certain way. Maybe I need to feel pressure to say my boss is the one who values my work or is the person I go to for advice. We know some of that does happen. On the flip side, I definitely feel like we are reaching our limits on using passive alone. Also for some of the reasons that Susan mentioned, we're missing the qualitative data. We spend a lot of time cleaning up the data, removing blast emails, trying to make sure that we're capturing real connections. But just because I email you a lot, and even if you answer me, it doesn't mean that I trust you, that I work with you, that we have a valuable relationship at all. Likewise, I may spend a lot of time pinging someone I'm very close to on Teams, or picking up the phone or having a quick conversation rather than writing formal emails. We also feel like we have questions that we'd like to answer, particularly when we were looking at the COVID studies, and there were some interesting changes, but I'm not able to go further into the why. We've kind of hit our limit there. It's what attracted us to it is the ease of implementation. We were at a point organizationally where we definitely had survey fatigue. We'd sort of lost control of our surveys. It's better now, but at the time, I think our response rate would have been low. And there may even have been some trust issues in terms of what are you doing with this and why are you asking me? So we felt passive was a quieter way. And we've actually socialized it though, although we've done it and we told people we were going to do it, but we pulled the data from before we made that declaration. So we didn't get any Hawthorne effect of people starting to try to change their behaviors in email. But I'm very interested in doing an active one. There's definitely questions that we would like to be able to get at that we can't through the passive ONA.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think kind of as you were alluding to that, there are advantages and disadvantages both, right? And so when you can combine the two, you kind of get the best of both worlds, right? Particularly when you can look at like the differences, because I think what you're saying there is like the objective versus the subjective, right? And Kate, I think that's something that that you're planning on doing pretty soon, right?
Yeah, we're starting it next week. It's resulting from, you know, like most companies, we're very focused on future of work. And, you know, a year ago, 100% of us were on site, except for our lab workers and our genome processing workers. Everyone has been remote. And, you know, post-COVID, this has worked relatively well. So we are going to stay as a hybrid organization in some capacity. So we want to be looking at this to figure out, you know, what are the relationships and how can we create meaningful connections, because the proverbial water cooler is gone. I don't think that's actually how connections often happened, but lots of people believe they bumped into people at the water cooler for those connections. So yeah, we're actually working with Andrew in Polinode that we're going to do both an active with a survey and the passive. I'm curious about the passive. I don't know. Our organization is a little bit different in that I would describe it as an open organization. We have 1,800 employees, but we have 6,500 Brodies. We do collaborative science across the world. And so you can be working in our lab and not be an employee. And so everyone's using different systems. So we don't have a closed Google suite. Lots of people are on Slack or they're on, you know, private channels, which we can't pull. My feeling is this is going to give us trend data. So I think it can give us a boost, but we would never be able to do passive that well from a system like that. Whereas like our performance review, I was able to pull it because it was everyone who participated.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to give us trend and some additional information. And what I'm hoping is, you know, if this takes off, do we do an active survey every year? And do we keep looking with the passive? So Andrew is helping us learn how to do that, because that's also a skill set we need to learn within our team. So we're excited about this.
Awesome. And then the other question that I often get asked quite a lot, which is related to this active versus passive question, is around privacy. So particularly on the passive side. So, and there are different ways of addressing that privacy question. And Laura, in your answer earlier, you kind of alluded to making people aware of the use of the data. So it'd just be great, maybe, Laura, if you can talk us through, you know, how you think about the privacy considerations, particularly around the passive side of things.
Yeah, so the first thing, you know, that we're real clear about is we are not touching content at all. We're looking at to and from and frequency during whatever time period, time window that we're looking at. We don't look at subject headers. We clean out through programmatically any emails going externally. So if you're emailing your husband or wife to pick up milk on the way home, we don't need to know that. So we really are limiting it to begin with to corporate communications. As an employee, you do sign an agreement saying that this is a corporate system and whatever you produce on is the property of the organization. But we don't want to misuse it, and we don't want to erode trust of our employee population. So we were very clear what we were doing, but like I said, we didn't announce it and then pulled the data. We announced it and then went back in time and pulled historical data so that we would not alter people's behavior or measure altered behavior.
Yeah.
We informed, but our perspective was that the consent that was provided by the employee as you onboard and agree to the policies of using our communication devices was sufficient.
Yeah, Makes sense. And Susan, I think this is a topic that you've given some thought to as well. I'd just love to hear your opinion on it.
Yeah, I think this is the reason that we haven't yet done passive, because I think it would take a lot of socialization to get people on board with, even they know that anything you write in an email, you know, is property of the company, or on Slack, but there's a difference, I think, between knowing it and really feeling it immediately. And so we haven't decided to touch that yet. As far as the survey results, we have identified results to a very, very small number of people. You know, the couple people on my team who are working on it, the CTO who sponsored it, and his very small leadership team. Other than that, when we've shared results with you know, teams within the organization, we strip out the names, we strip out, you know, identifying characteristics, and are showing sort of schematic graphs, because you know, it is a survey where we've committed to keep your responses anonymous, and so we've been pretty thoughtful and, you know, aligned with both our privacy team and legal, as well as with folks in HR around, you know, when can something have a name on it, when can it not, when can we show identifying information around like the role or the team, and when not. And then we've been very open with findings like, you know, the effective recognition on belonging, or the effective mentorship on belonging, things that are really aggregate, are the things that we have shared the most widely in and outside of the company.
Yeah. And I think when you go through that process of talking about the results with people, that helps to build trust for future organizational network analysis as well.
Well, and also seeing that there's something of value that comes from it, you know, so not just, hey, we found some results, but here's what we're doing about it. And we hope to be able to come back in, you know, a matter of months and survey again and see if there's a difference.
Yep. Makes sense. So I think one of the last questions I'll have is, you know, I often get asked this question from people who are looking to get started in organizational network analysis. So people who might not have that much experience. And I think for some of you, it wasn't that long ago that you were looking to get started in organizational network analysis. So what I'd like to ask is, do you have any, you know, suggestions for people who might be, you know, looking to get started in ONA? Hints, tips, tricks, suggestions. So Kate, I might start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is start small on something tangible that means something to a particular group. So, you know, I was keeping my ears to the ground, and when I heard the culture committee wanted to interview people, immediately I was like, can I pitch ONA? And so that's what I did. But I think also, you know, to start small like that, at that time, I had a really great data scientist on my team who could, you know, we were good at designing surveys, but how to actually analyze the results. I can't imagine even starting small without a cloud-based tool unless you have resources that you can really dedicate to this, because it does take so much time. But mine would be start small, build the case before you go broader. You know, we are hoping to go wide with what we're doing right now, but it's been 4 years in the making.
Yep, makes sense. Thank you. Laura, anything from you on this one?
Yeah, I think the way that we started to kind of get buy-in was around change management. Everyone has change going on in their organization. We know that 70% of change efforts fail to be persistent. And so we pitched it as, let us identify your influencers within your network that can help form a change network and become change champions for whatever it is that you're trying to do. We started small. We actually did it within HR, which is kind of unusual, right? Usually they're the cobbler's children. So it was a smaller group, and we used a basic license from Polinode. So we started with a cloud tool, but we started simple with a very specific question to answer. I think that really helps garner support, is know what you're answering. Now, we pulled that data set and twisted it as many ways as we could think of. We appended all kinds of extra data in there and really studied it so that we could learn and understand and really think creatively about its potential. But our cause, our toe in the water, was change management, which is a simple, relatively simple approach.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, stay focused initially, prove the case, and then go from there. Nice. Susan, anything from you on this one?
I would echo Laura's point that having a focused research question is really important. I think if you're new to network data, something that can be surprising is just how rich it is and how many different directions there are to explore. It's really easy to get sort of dazzled by these colorful graphs and, you know, who's this over there, who's that over there, and kind of come away feeling like it has been so interesting, but I couldn't tell you what I learned. And so ahead of time, really scoping out a couple of very focused questions, maybe even some yes/no questions, because I think it's easy to ask something like, well, how can we collaborate better? You know, or why does it take so long to get things done? And you can get network insights that will help you with those, but it'll be a really long process to get there. But if you can come up with a much narrower question, at least to begin with, you know, how does recognition relate to belonging? Or who are our influencers? Who are our energizers? Some relatively well-specified questions, I think, can be a great start. And then, you know, every answer leads to more questions. So you won't run out of interest.
No, nice one. Terrific. So unfortunately, we've run out of time, but that was a really good discussion. Really appreciate everybody's contributions and insights. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.